This week marks the 25th anniversary of the deaths of one of the most significant figures in the history of rock and roll music. I'm speaking about Kurt Cobain, lead singer, songwriter, and guitar player for the band Nirvana. Kurt was a fascinating and powerful and compelling figure. When he came along, I'd already reached adulthood. I thought I had seen the last of the sort of great iconic rock and roll brilliant figures until he came along, and that changed my opinion considerably. My next guest has just written a book about Kurt Cobain. Danny Goldberg was one of his managers. He has also been a record company president, communications, public relations guy, journalist. He's the president of Gold Village Entertainment, if I didn't mention that already. And his new book is entitled Serving the Servant, Remembering Kurt Cobain. He joins us now. So first of all, Danny, thanks for coming back on the program.
Hey, Richard. Nice to be back.
Well, good to have you. And secondly, I'm starting to read the book now. I'm really enjoying the book. What drove you to write it? Were people asking you to do it? Was it just you felt that things hadn't been said about Kurt? What was the main impetus behind it?
Well, there were two kind of parallel things. One is I'd felt over the last decade or so that somehow the image of Kurt had become distorted by his death, that it was so grotesque and so tragic that he was known a little bit more for his death than for his life. And my memory of him was of his life. He was a lovely guy. You know, he had a lot of darkness that was prone to depression, but that darkness was all inner-directed. He was very, very kind to the people around him, particularly to me. And he also was a real-life genius, and of the people I worked with, the most brilliant person I ever worked with up close. And I thought that there might be room for a different portrait of him. I didn't know if it was worth a book or an article, or it was just in the back of my mind. And then the other thing that happened was that I've been writing more the last few years. I've scaled down, I have a smaller management company now, and had published a book in 2017 that was a really rewarding process for me. It was a book I wrote about the 60s. And when I got to the holiday period of 2017, I just was thinking, what else should I write? And I was obviously aware of the calendar and that this would be the 25th anniversary. So I, tried to put together a proposal. I know you've been there and got it out to an agent, and then somebody bought it. So then I was stuck. I had to write the book.
Yeah, that's how it works usually, particularly if you accept in advance. Then they really are expecting that at some point.
I was thinking to myself, it was just something then. So it started as a notion, and then within 6 weeks it became an obsession. And I had to write it pretty quickly to meet the deadline. So I was kind of in a trance for about 8 months doing it. I interviewed about 40 people. It's not a biography of Kurt. It's a memoir of the 3.5 years during which I knew him and worked with him, starting about 9 months before Nevermind came out, when Nirvana came looking for management in Los Angeles and picked my company, Gold Mountain Entertainment. I had a younger partner named John Silva that understood the punk rock subculture intimately. He's very successful today with the Foo Fighters and everything, but then he was just starting. I had an older roster that included Bonnie Raitt and Ricky Lee Jones and Allman Brothers, but I wanted to expand into this new energy that I knew was coming. I didn't know it was going to be Nirvana, so I just tried to describe those 3.5 years until he died, and talked to the people that I knew that worked with me during that time, looked through my old files, searched my memories, went online and read hundreds of interviews, and then just kept writing and rewriting until they wouldn't let me rewrite anymore, and I had to hand it in.
Well, one of the things that struck me in reading the book and in reading about the book is, the nature of the relationship you had with Kurt, because, back in my early days, I tried to be a rock and roll artist. I had several managers, and I've got to say, I never felt like having one of them be the best man at my wedding, or that seems, or other signs of closeness, or thought of them as like a father to me. that strikes me as very outside the typical artist-manager relationship, to have what clearly was a genuine friendship and genuine warmth between the two individuals. I don't know how unusual that really is, but it felt like that to me, and it felt like something special.
Well, it was special. It's not unheard of, that's for sure. Each artist is different, each manager is different, each one of these relationships is different. There are a few well-known relationships in the music business in my lifetime. One is John Landau and Bruce Springsteen, Kenny Laguna and Joan Jett. There are some relationships that really become friendships. I only got to work with Kurt for those few years, but just through the quirk of the rhythms of what was happening in his life and in mine, we did develop a real personal connection in addition to the professional services. And I just loved the guy. And for whatever reason, he felt comfortable with me in certain situations. And I was glad to do anything I could for him. I mean, the business part of it was easy. He was a genius. He was a creature of his times. He wrote those songs. Once Nevermind came out, it almost sold itself, despite all of the, I described the mechanics we tried to go through with the video and the radio strategy and the touring, and I think everybody did a terrific job, but it was going to explode. When it went to #1, the New York Times interviewed Eddie Rosenblatt, the president of Geffen, and said, what was the marketing strategy on Nevermind? And he said, the marketing strategy was get out of the way and duck. And so that was true. And the rest of it, of renegotiating a deal, getting advances, figuring out the touring economics, was pretty easy because they were just so big so quickly. The personal side of it was quite complicated because of the dramas that surrounded him and Courtney Love, who he got connected to romantically about a month after Nevermind came out, and married not that long after. And I liked Courtney. My wife at the time, Rosemary Carroll, had been her lawyer, and Courtney and I just kind of clicked right away. And I recognized this was kind of an advantage of being older, that Kurt was in love with her, that this was not some passing rock and roll fling. And the other people around Nirvana didn't get it. So I went from being kind of the older guy that knew the record business to being the one person that kind of understood that relationship. And that created the personal side of the relationship. And, he was hard to know. He was very complicated. He was prone to depression. I didn't play music with him. I didn't take dope with him. I'm not pretending I was his best friend. But I was a friend. And he was so lovely to me. And in general, a very sweet guy. Not everyone who's brilliant is also nice, as you know.
Yeah.
But he was. So I just had this notion of him in my mind that I've carried all these years, that I just thought might be a good portrait to join the others. I'm not saying it's the truth about him, but it's a truth about him that's a little different from the other public portraits of him, because I didn't do it as a journalist. I did it as somebody who worked with him.
Yeah, I understand that. And I do think, A, that the word genius gets overused, and B, that Kurt Cobain was one. I mean, I think there was genuine brilliance there, and I read some things about him during his life and after his death that showed the depth of his interests in things like William S. Burroughs and his writing and different writing techniques and different musical techniques. I thought he had a terrific voice.
He was always doing drawing. He started in his mind as a young teenager as a graphic artist, and there's also, a lot of the graphics came from him. But the thing about Kurt, when people look at Nirvana, and it was a band, it was 3 guys, it was Dave Grohl, this amazing drummer who's gone on to have a great career with the Foo Fighters, Chris Novoselic, who great bass player for Nirvana, and Kurt's good friend for so many years, and created Nirvana with him. But just factually, Kurt wrote the songs. He wrote the lyrics and the music. He was the lead singer and the lead guitar player. I always say he did everything in Nirvana that Jimmy Page and Robert Plant did in Zeppelin, everything that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards did in the Stones. And Kurt also storyboarded the videos, designed the album covers, actually designed some of the T-shirts, and made all of the decisions for the band. So he certainly, whatever Nirvana was, came from him. And he did kind of reinvent rock and roll at a time when it was becoming quite predictable and pop, the so-called hair band era. and that he re-injected substance and meaning into it. But he was such a good craftsman, understanding pop melody and heavy metal power, as well as punk rock culture, that he was able to fuse them together in a way that was extremely commercial at the same time as being very intimate. Which, there's other artists that have done it in the history of rock and roll. I think Bruce Springsteen at his best has done that, and John Lennon and Dylan, but it's a short list, and Kurt's on it.
Yeah, it's a really short list, and a equally short list, probably with the same names on it, plus maybe Bob Marley, James Brown, I don't know, whoever, are people whose music became not only great on its own merits, but really shifted the culture. And one of the things that really amazed me about Kurt and Nirvana was the effect that not just that their music was great and a lot of people bought it, a lot of people listened to it, went to the concerts, but that it changed fashion, to a certain extent, maybe even politics, because Kurt was, very progressive from what I could tell in his politics, and outspoken about it. But that they really had the kind of impact I thought that maybe had left the rock and roll scene, wasn't going to happen again. My sense was it happened with them, and I have no idea what that felt like from the inside, but it must have been astonishing.
It was really exciting. When you're in the middle of these things, you're kind of day to day, minute to minute, and don't have as much perspective. But even at the time, I'd been around long enough to know it was a very special moment. And one of the ways Kurt impacted the culture, and again, he's not the only person who did this, but on a very short list, he redefined masculinity in the rock world. David Bowie had done that a few years earlier. The Beatles did it with the long hair. Elvis did it with a swiveling of the hips. But Kurt really showed that you could rock, and he could out-rock anybody. I mean, heavy metal fans loved Nirvana. It was #1 on heavy metal radio also. But he showed that you could be powerful in a rock and roll way and be compassionate, sensitive, and authentic. The kind of the opposite of the hair bands or the guys who obviously spend a lot of time in the gym so they look good with their shirt off in the videos. And that's a reverberation that to this day, when I looked on the message boards of some of the fan sites or things like that, is that people learn from, because that's one of the many roles of music in the culture is kind of sexual identity. So he was progressive politically. He voted Democratic. He didn't talk about it a lot. He didn't want to become known as a preachy artist. He was very careful, and I describe in the book how he balanced out focusing on entertainment and pulling back from being too preachy, and then taking stands when the popularity was enough, and he didn't want to shirk his sense of obligation to the culture. And he was very much against homophobia, misogyny. He and Courtney called me one day in the middle of '92, proudly telling me they just donated $100 each to Jerry Brown's primary campaign. And then when Clinton got the nomination, he told a couple of interviewers he voted for Clinton. He was not an anarchist. He was a progressive, and he wasn't a political artist, but he was an artist who let his political views be known as sort of part of his role of being in the culture and knowing that millions of people were paying attention to him. He somehow internalized all this and executed it to a degree close to perfection artistically. He had a lot of problems in his personal life, obviously, demons, drug addiction, and ultimate suicide. But he did compartmentalize his talents as an artist, and it's a pretty extraordinary track record over those 3.5 years, what he was able to bring to the culture and to the world. And for some reason that I can't completely articulate, but I know is true, there's young people today who still identify with Nirvana records. You see them, people in their 20s or teens wearing Nirvana t-shirts, and there's something about the way he tuned into adolescent anguish that transcends his own generation. The only analog I could come up with was the way Catcher in the Rye has done that generation. So again, a short list of artists who's been able to do this. He's one of them, and he's the only one I got to work with up close. And I'm the only one who worked with him up close who felt like writing a book about it so far. So that's what the book is.
Well, Holden Caulfield with the guitar. I'll have to hold that image. It's a great read, very well written, a lot of insight, and I encourage folks to take a look at it. The book is Serving the Servant, Remembering Kurt Cobain. The author is Danny Goldberg. Danny, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, pal.